guys for being here. Full room, that's great. Just to introduce myself, I'm Kurt Vonnegut. I'm an associate professor of economics and director of the Menard Family George Washington Forum. I want to thank those that helped make tonight's event possible, including Greta Suter and Miriam Intrater of the Ohio University Libraries for really spearheading this event and making it possible. Also want to recognize Professor Alec Holcomb, who is the director of the Contemporary History Institute, who's co-sponsoring the event, and also want to recognize Cameron Dunbar, our program coordinator, who did a lot of the heavy lifting in making tonight's event possible. So tonight's a unique confluence of world history and Ohio University history, where we're going to hear about Professor Doxsee's and Kurt Vonnegut's shared experience during World War II, and also hear from an accomplished alumna, Isabel Planton, and share her insights and expertise on Vonnegut and his work. The George Washington Forum, if you're not aware of what we do, sorry, Alec, I'm not going to talk about the Contemporary History Institute. Would you like a little bit of time? Okay. But I just want to share, we're a program for undergraduate students that we dive into philosophy, politics, economics, history, humanities, all sorts of different fields. And in the last couple of years, our focus in our reading group, in our speaker series, has been understanding the human condition during times of the Great Enrichment and Industrial Revolution, where we saw economic progress, where we saw innovation, where we saw a lot of changes to our material well-being, and trying to understand what do those things mean for other aspects of our life. And part of our reading group, Vonnegut's Player Piano and Cat's Cradle made really important contributions to our discussions and understanding, important aspects of life beyond just material well-being. Increases in knowledge, material well-being, those things are really important, but Vonnegut's deft use of absurdism and satire really highlighted the importance of family, friendship, finding purpose, right? Finding tranquility in life in other aspects beyond just the material. So it's been a lot of fun. So I want to introduce our wonderful speakers. We're lucky to have two very talented people with us tonight. I'll first introduce Isabel Planton. She received her BA in English Literature from Ohio University in 2006 and a Master's in Library Science from Indiana University in 2008. She worked in the Teaching and Research Department at the Lilly Library at Indiana University from 2011 until just recently, before taking a position as archivist at the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan. During her time at the Lilly Library, she became increasingly interested in the library's extensive manuscript collections related to Vonnegut. Ms. Planton has curated 3 Vonnegut exhibitions and given talks on various aspects of his life and writings. And then I want to also introduce Dr. Kevin Ruffner. He served a variety of domestic and foreign assignments with the Central Intelligence Agency from 1991 until his retirement in 2017. As a member of the CIA history staff, he worked on major declassification projects, including the Corona satellite system and Nazi war criminals and collaborators. The agency subsequently declassified his publication as part of the 1998 Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. In addition to his civilian career in the federal government, Dr. Ruffner served in the regular Army, the Army National Guard, Army Reserve from 1982 until his retirement in 2010. Dr. Ruffner earned her PhD in American Civilization at the George Washington University, and he is a 2024-2025 Broadening Academic Initiative Hybrid Fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Please help me give them a warm Ohio University welcome.
Thank you so much. So I was going to start by just talking about the Kurt Vonnegut papers at the Lilly Library for a little bit, because I think that they're fascinating, and if you haven't been to the Lilly Library, it's worth a visit. It's open to anybody who has an interest in the collections there. Beyond the Kurt Vonnegut papers, there are 8.5 million manuscripts and about 500,000 books in the collection. It's in Bloomington, Indiana. The Kurt Vonnegut manuscript collection itself started coming to IU in 1997, and it was Kurt Vonnegut's wish that it actually be at Indiana University. He did not go to school there at all. He had no affiliation with Indiana University, but he was from Indianapolis, and he had a lot of strong feelings about the state of Indiana throughout his life. He wrote about it, and he wanted his papers to be at one of the premier special collections libraries in the state of Indiana. So that's how it came to be there. Additions have come to the collection over the years since then. In 2002, 2007, 2010, 2014, they keep coming in. So there's always new things being added. And there are other associated collections as well. There's the papers of Donald Farber, who was his attorney and friend and also his sole literary agent for many years. So there's a lot of business records having to do with Kurt Vonnegut's publication career, as well as the papers of S.M. Harris, so another correspondent of his, the L. Rust Hills papers. He was a author and Esquire fiction editor, and there's some correspondence with Vonnegut there. A couple other individuals who corresponded with him, and the papers made it into the collection. There's also a periodical contributions by and about Kurt Vonnegut collection that includes about 50 different periodicals that he wrote for. So you can see his early career in writing for magazines as well. The majority of the collection so it's split up into correspondence, and there's not a lot that's early. People would often ask to see things from around the time he got back from the war, or in his early years as a writer, and that just isn't there. I think those papers may still be in the possession of the family. But it picks up around when his career as a novelist was taking off, and there are a lot of years of correspondence there. Some of the highlights for me, there's a lot of fan letters in the collection. People really clearly felt a personal connection with his writings and would write to him like a friend, and have like all these kind of insider things that they would be saying based on his novels that are really interesting to look at. There's also, in the later parts of the correspondence, he would fax things to the director of the Lilly Library. If he just had a thought he had later in life, he'd just send a fax, and those faxes are printed out and in the collection as well. And in the early 2000s, he was in correspondence with a fourth grade teacher from somewhere in California, I want to say. And the fourth graders were tasked with taking a Kurt Vonnegut quote and interpreting it the way they understood it and then drawing a picture of it. And they sent this booklet to Vonnegut. And we have that in the collection, and it's just one of my favorite parts of it, the way that they interpreted things in their drawings. So then as far as the writings that are there include copies of his columns from the Cornell Daily Sun from 1941 to 43, which was some of his earliest published writing. He did write for, I think, his high school paper as well. We've got there the first drafts of the report on the Barnhouse effect, which is his first published piece of writing in like a major periodical in Collier's. And then drafts of many of the novels. The Sirens of Titan draft in particular is an interesting one because he stapled and taped them together into these big scrolls. So they're still rolled up on tubes, and you can look at them as scrolls, which is different than the way he did other novels later. He did a little bit of taping and cutting for, I think, Breakfast of Champions as well, but not to the same extent. Slaughterhouse-Five drafts, which I'll get into a little bit more very soon. There are so many starts to that novel, and you can just see the excruciating process right there on the page in all of these. Typed and then handwritten and then typed, and he started over a lot of times. And basically all of his other major novels too, there are manuscripts there to see. He then also did a lot of speaking during the later years of his life. He was invited to speak at a lot of universities and graduation events and things like that. Those speeches are there, as well as this game that he invented called GHQ, which has just recently been published by, I think, Barnes & Noble put out a published version of it. He had created this war strategy game. General Headquarters is what GHQ stands for. And he tried to get it published I think in the 60s, 50s or 60s, and he could not find a taker for the game. But somebody finally got it launched within the past year or so. But we have the original write-up of his plan for the game and how all of it would work, what the board would look like, and his application to various companies to try to get it off the ground. And then there's also some artwork, and later in his career, he did a lot of silkscreen printing with an artist named Joe Petro from Kentucky, and the Lilly Library has a lot of examples of those. They're big, silkscreen, they kind of look like his signature, if you've ever seen it, that's like his face in a line drawing. He was quite this sketcher and doodler. And he came from a family of artists, so he had quite an artistic bent as well as being a writer. That's just a little bit about the Lilly. I'm happy to answer questions about it later. But I'm also going to talk at more length about these two papers that are in the Kurt Vonnegut collection. So I wanted to start this with this quote that's from one of the drafts in the collection. And I realize it's a little hard to see this type on tan paper in this room. You probably can't see it very well in the back at all. Okay. It says, I have lived this, dreamed this, changed all the names and faces, and dreamed this again. Nobody is real. And then he's crossed out, not even I. This is kind of a very, one of many pages, and I've got just pages and pages of the starting over and over of his drafts for Slaughterhouse-5. And we don't, at the Lilly, they don't really know what order these were written in. Nobody has yet really sorted that out completely, and they're just kind of in folders, mishmash together. And you can see that sometimes he's speaking in the first person. 3 in our labor unit in Dresden died, he says. I was in a great catastrophe one time. Then sometimes he's got another character that's not himself. My name is Miles Vernon. I'm 41 years old. And you can see that he's like really working on it. It's not coming easy. There's a lot of doodles like this. He's thinking through possible plot progressions, lots of different potential first, characters for the narrator. At the bottom of this page, here's a bunch of ideas. Short story for introduction, The Little Girls, The World's Fair. So that made it in. Short story on the boxcars. Short story on IVB. Shamil thrown into excrement. Short story on the diseased meat. The guy who is head of the camp feeds all. And he's just like really just brainstorming very loosely. These are more, even more. I am David McSwan. In the start of 1. I've written fiction for 15 years now. That sounds more like Kurt Vonnegut himself. You get the sense. You get the idea. Yeah, more. Okay. So with that, so I wanted to show those slides to show you that he made multiple attempts to frame the story, to populate it with characters, to insert his own experience, and to distance himself from it. During a 1974 interview with Joe David Bellamy and John Casey, Kurt Vonnegut had this to say about Dresden and the writing of Slaughterhouse-5 and its aftermath. Quote, Dresden was a highly ornamented city, like Paris. There were no air raid shelters, just ordinary cellars because a raid was not expected and the war was almost over. We got through it, the Americans there, because we were quartered in the stockyards, where it was wide and open and there was a meat locker 3 stories beneath the surface, the only decent shelter in the city. So we went down into the meat locker, and when we came up again, the city was gone and everybody was dead. We walked for miles before we saw anybody else. All organic things were consumed. Anyway, I came home in 1945, started writing about it, and wrote about it, and wrote about it, and wrote about it. This thin book is about what it's like to write a book about a thing like that. I couldn't get much closer. I would head myself into the memory of it. The circuit breakers would kick out. I'd head in again. I'd back off. The book is a process of 20 years of this sort of living with Dresden and the aftermath. In Kurt Vonnegut's famous novel, he finally speaks out decades after the fact about his experience as a prisoner during and after the Allied firebombing of Dresden on the night of February 13th through 14th of 1945. If you've read Slaughterhouse-5, or any of his works really, you know that he exhibited an almost unparalleled ability to blend human tragedy with absurd humor in his writing. A few years ago, a couple of papers in the Lilly Library's collection came to my attention, thanks to a researcher really, that were from the early years of Kurt Vonnegut's experience after World War II when he was an anthropology student at the University of Chicago. And he was writing what seemed to be kind of prototypes for what would later turn into Slaughterhouse-5. So I'm going to talk more about those. Okay, so after the war, Kurt Vonnegut enrolled in the University of Chicago on the GI Bill. And while he never completed his degree in anthropology, he did work on a thesis titled The Mythologies of North American Nativistic Movements, which there's a copy of at the Lilly Library. And then these other papers. So there are multiple drafts of this one called I Shall Not Want, which I can show you these more later because they're so faint. And the other one is called The Psychology of Hunger. And they were sort of buried in the Lilly Library's collections amongst college papers, or I think the Psychology of Hunger one is in college papers. I Shall Not Want is interspersed with things in the Slaughterhouse-5 folders, but it wasn't clear that this is actually written decades earlier. It was written right after the war. The Psychology of Hunger was for his Psychology 201 class, and he submitted it on March 11th, 1946. I Shall Not Want is an undated creative writing piece, which he submitted to the New Republic as an entry in a short story contest. The contest was announced in the New Republic in the November 4th, 1946 issue, and it was open to veterans of both sexes now attending college under the GI Bill of Rights. The winners and honorable mentions, not including Kurt Vonnegut, were announced in the April 14th, 1947 issue. Based on these dates, Kurt Vonnegut wrote both The Psychology of Hunger and I Shall Not Want within a one-year period, and he wrote both pieces within the first 2 years after the Dresden firebombing. And the stories carry a lot of themes and share specific imagery about his time there after the firebombing. These aren't the only early Vonnegut stories to deal with war themes. As Ginger Strand notes in the Brothers Vonnegut, Science and Fiction in the House of Magic, he wrote Atrocity Story at Fort Riley while awaiting his discharge at the end of the war. And that story deals with the aftermath of the war and several soldiers' attempts at the Red Cross camp near Le Havre to bring to the attention of the officers in the War Crimes Commission tent the shooting of a fellow starving POW for plundering. He also wrote Wailing Shall Be All in the Streets in the early days after his return from war and before he wrote I Shall Not Want. There he takes a more direct approach, presenting a first-person account of his experience to address the atrocities of the bombing of Dresden. He writes, late in February 1945, Dresden, Germany was destroyed, and with it 100,000 human beings. I was there. Not many know how tough America got. The story was rejected 6 times by various publications. And that's another thing in the Lilly Library collections. There are a lot of his rejection letters that he received. He wrote to many, many publications and was told no in his early career. And he kept all of the rejection letters. And his daughter told me that he had a trash can that he had like completely shellacked with the rejection letters too, as a kind of way to decorate. As Jerome Klinkowitz has pointed out in his book, Slaughterhouse-5, Reforming the Novel and the War, in post-war America, Vonnegut did not find a ready audience for stories about the firebombing of Dresden. And that's what this slide was about, is him talking about the Holocaust particularly, and how that was what people could and would talk about, but not the firebombing of Dresden. And this is the Jerome Klinkowitz quote. At the University of Chicago, as a graduate student in anthropology, the repatriated young Army vet and former prisoner of war found his professors unwilling to discuss any negative aspects of the war beyond Hitler's infamy and the Holocaust that had exterminated up to 6 million Jews and other presumed political enemies. And so Kurt Vonnegut found himself channeled back into the American middle-class style of life that he had experienced before the war. Indeed, in one draft of Slaughterhouse-5, Vonnegut directly addresses this cultural silence about the firebombing of Dresden vis-a-vis the much more predominant discussions of the Holocaust. And he's written here, please don't talk to me about concentration camps, about the 7 million people the Germans killed in those. At any rate, don't talk to me about them as though I might well pick up a little of Eichmann's guilt if I suggest that the Dresden massacre was a crying shame. As he was struggling with his experiences in Dresden, Vonnegut may have identified that GI short story contest in the New Republic as a natural audience for his war writings. It was a contest meant to help discover fresh, authentic voices among veterans of the recent war who are now attending colleges or other institutions of higher learning. In the February 24th, 1947 issue under New Republic News, the judges of the contest offered a summation of what was troubling the veterans in the over 2,000 entries they had received. In the first place, it's evident that most ex-GIs are restless. They don't want to go back to humdrum civilian jobs after the dramatic adventures of their past few years. More than that, they're not in a mood to put up with the uncertainties, injustices, and frustrations they see about them. They have no use for boarding house living, and they have no tolerance for Jim Crow transportation, and many of them will rattle the teeth of anyone who plays at Jew baiting. Quite hilariously, considering that Vonnegut did not even make honorable mention in this contest, the editors go on to assure readers, by and large, we'd guess the boys have come home in good shape. They won't all be writers, heaven knows, but they'll be buckling down to something useful. So now to the I shall not want section. While getting published wasn't easy, Vonnegut tried to get some of his thoughts about the experience on paper in the early years after his return, specifically focusing on the hunger that he and other men experienced as they worked with picks and shovels every day on a diet of 1 cup of coffee, 4 slices of black bread, and 1 pint of potato soup. In both of the early pieces, we see Vonnegut working out how to talk about the severe deprivations he suffered in Dresden. In one draft of I Shall Not Want, he writes, "Those who read this article possibly will find my treatment of so serious and excruciating a thing as hunger as frivolous and, in the desperate light of the present world situation, in bad taste. I know what starvation is like because I starved. I know how starving men act in a few phases of their dismal lives. I have here reported to the best of my recollection. Hunger is serious, but it makes men foolish, irrational. Some of the things they did are screamingly funny. So are some of the things a lunatic does." He goes on to recount tales that are, maybe you decide, screamingly funny in parts and definitely horrific in other parts. He explains that among the 150 captured American infantry privates put to work in Dresden as prisoners of war, they had no Red Cross food parcels and were obliged to do pick and shovel labor 7 days a week with every other Sunday afternoon off. One man was shot to death by a firing squad for stealing a can of string beans from the rubble of a home. And if this sounds familiar, that is because a similar incident occurs in Slaughterhouse 5 when Edgar Derby is shot for looting a teapot from the ruins of the city. The men found creative ways to cope with starvation, as he writes about in this piece. From a stationery store that was destroyed in the firebombing, the men salvaged some notebooks in which they listed in excruciating detail the foods they craved. The act of creating lists was simultaneously soothing and taxing on the men's emotions. To make an addition was cause for excitement. There were controversies. One I recall was whether sweet potatoes and yams were the same or not. Once convinced that in listing them both he had duplicated, a man sorrowfully erased one and was visibly depressed for the rest of the day. Consensus among the men rested on one coveted concoction in particular, and that's on this page. 6 pancakes made with raisins in the batter, stacked with a fried egg between each layer, topped with a 1/4 pound of butter and drenched in honey. Vonnegut describes the exact same meal in the other paper that I'm talking about, The Psychology of Hunger, and I think it's an early example of a running theme in his writing, in this case drawn from real life. In addition to the collective food lists, one man was in high demand for his ability to make artistic renderings of food fantasies in his notebook. The men also fantasized together about going on an eating bender immediately upon their return to New York. They created fantasy menus and acted out scenes. Quote, "There amid the desolation with the flashes of gunfire on the horizon, I played the part of a waiter, asking each member of the group what he would like for breakfast, lunch, and supper in New York." And then Vonnegut includes his own menu as a sample. The asterisk marks POW inventions, and his obsession with the pancake dish is apparent as it makes it onto this list as well. So this is a menu that includes a tall glass of orange juice, chocolate oatmeal with sugar and cream, the 6 pancake concoction, ham and bacon, hash brown potatoes, biscuits and grape jam, and coffee and milk. And then there's something called Depression Special here that I have in my notes. That is specifically a loaf of bread cut in half, with each half hollowed out, filled with 1 pound of boiled beans, cost 11 cents. And a friend of Vonnegut's who had bummed around during the last depression had written it down for him during the Dresden period, and he found the note tucked away in his billfold after the war. So he was thinking about that during his doodling here. In The Psychology of Hunger, Vonnegut takes the same experience and uses it to flesh out a scientific argument about the behavior patterns of hungry men, citing current research on rats and mice and humans in conjunction with his personal stories. He says that his experience is as close as one could get to an experimental control group for a starvation experiment. He then rehashes the notebooks, the drawings, the fantasy foods of I Shall Not Want, this time backing up every personal experience he had with a quotation from the literature on the psychology of hunger. And there's just a couple pages from that. Certainly, neither of these works is a Vonnegut masterpiece, but they do reveal many details about his life as a POW and some details about his early writing process. The importance of his wife, Jane Cox, later Vonnegut, her influence on his writing career must not be overlooked or underestimated. At this early date, Jane was supporting Kurt in his writing and helped him with his prose style. Not on these pages so much, but in some of the pages there are corrections in her hand, and she's like eliminating wordiness and getting rid of stilted constructions in his writing. And she did edit it before he sent it off to the New Republic College contest. Strand describes the couple's early conversations about Kurt's writing career in both The Brothers Vonnegut and in her article for The New Yorker, which is called How Jane Vonnegut Made Kurt Vonnegut a Writer. Strand had access to letters held in the Vonnegut family collection, which illuminate the conversations between the couple in the early days of their marriage, right after the end of the war. As Strand recounts in her article for The New Yorker, in November of 1945, Kurt wrote to Jane after reading the Foreign Affairs section of Newsweek. He was in a state of excitement because he suddenly realized that, quote, everything that was reported by ace newsmen from the heart of Europe I found to be old stuff to me. By Jesus, I was there. Perhaps for the first time, Jane's encouragement, coupled with a healthy dose of outside inspiration, led Kurt to believe he really did have a voice and something important to say. And these were the early seeds, I think, of Slaughterhouse-Five many years later. 2 decades later, in the mid-1960s, Vonnegut was trying to make his war novel take shape still. When he was a writer in residence, teaching at the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop from 1965 to 67, he tried again to make a cohesive novel out of the multiple beginnings and unfinished chapters. And the Lilly Library has just, as I said, drafts and drafts of that material. In these drafts, we see him flirting with the line between fiction and autobiography, and it's almost as if, well, it really is, he's discussing his technique with himself as he figures it out. In one draft, he begins, even though this is about things that really happened to me and around me, I will have to make them up. I have written fiction for 15 years. It's too late for me to write anything else. If I give my word of honor that something is true, then the sentence immediately following usually is fairly true. The sentences after that, though, unless I repeat the pledge, become more and more fanciful until some people who are listening will swear I'm insane. Through the lens of trauma studies, several authors have analyzed Vonnegut's work and suggest that the final product, Slaughterhouse-Five, was a successful coping mechanism of sorts for him. As Francisco Collado Rodriguez posits in Experimental Fiction and Trauma Studies, the case of Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, experimental strategies that have their origin in scientific discourse, trauma, and metafiction merge smoothly all along the novel, offering a therapeutic way to cope with the traumatic events reported in the narrative. Survivors of traumatic events often cannot face or talk about the reality of a horrific experience in a head-on, literal manner. And indeed, much like Kurt Vonnegut himself, his character Billy Pilgrim in Slaughterhouse-Five attempts to escape reality. As Vonnegut writes in the final version of the novel, they, being the characters Elliot Rosewater and Billy Pilgrim, had both found life meaningless, partly because of what they had seen in war. Rosewater, for instance, had shot a 14-year-old fireman, mistaking him for a German soldier. So it goes. And Billy had seen the greatest massacre in European history, which was the firebombing of Dresden. So it goes. So they were trying to reinvent themselves and their universe. Science fiction was a big help. Starting from I Shall Not Want and going into Psychology of Hunger and some of his early other works, Vonnegut eventually worked his way to a more effective and perhaps more therapeutic method of writing his story. In a similar article assessing Vonnegut's work in the light of modern psychiatric awareness of PTSD symptoms and coping mechanisms, Suzanne V's Golani writes, "The text implies that because the horrible consequences of the bombing of Dresden truly happened, but are too far removed from normal experience to be easily reported, they can neither be completely fictionalized nor simply repeated through an eyewitness account. The novel thus becomes a mixture of autobiography and fiction that simultaneously binds Vonnegut to and distances him from the text and its implications." What becomes apparent in his prototypical college-era writings on the subject is that the Dresden experience was formative and life-defining for him, and that the writing of Slaughterhouse-Five was a multi-decade struggle because the topic was so personal, traumatic, and monumental. It was the story that he most needed to tell and to tell correctly. In these drafts, we the readers get to observe as Vonnegut starts from a place of pure fact and moves toward the beautiful, crucial blending of fact and fiction that is the final work. And then I'll just leave you with this slide that says, "This is fiction. I dreamed all this, and I changed the names of all the people in the dream, and I had them all exchange faces and events, and then I redreamed it with the names changed. And then I had everyone exchange names and events and faces and mannerisms, and then I redreamed it again. This is fiction. I dreamed all this, and then I changed the names of all the people in the dream, and then I had them all exchange faces and hometowns and fates and propensities, and then I dreamed them again." Thank you.
Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to be here in Athens and to see Isabel again and Greta, and also to meet all of you from the Contemporary History Institute and the George Washington Forum. I have to say personally, it's a pleasure to be in Athens, to escape from Washington at this particular time over the last, say, 2 months, 2.5 months. It's been really depressing in Washington, and I know it's echoing throughout the country. So we'll have to get through it, hopefully, as we progress. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about something that happened 80 years ago. And that's one reason why we're here today, is because about a year ago, I was passing through Ohio University here in Athens to do research on the Doxsee papers, and then going out to Indiana University to look at the Vonnegut papers, and such a wealth of material in both collections, reinforcing each other, but not really necessarily connected. And this gives us an opportunity today to do that, to bring the connection of what OU has, what IU has, and how they really amplify Kurt Vonnegut's later work on Slaughterhouse-Five, but also the life of Professor Doxsee and what he did during World War II, and the ties that both men have together. So that's what I'd like to talk about tonight. I too was there, Gifford B, Doxsee, Kurt Vonnegut Jr., and their shared experiences at Dresden Slaughterhouse-Five. And it's really exciting topic in my mind. I started this last year, but had been working on it for years earlier on war crimes, not only Nazi war crimes, but particularly against US soldiers, which is not a common theme compared to Japanese war crimes. But there were certainly enough German war crimes. We think about the Malmedy massacre as one, and then also more recent, also another case that's lesser known that did not get a major trial in the case of the American prisoners of war, many of whom were Jewish, who were grouped together, 350 of them, removed from their prisoner of war camp, sent to a work detail, and essentially worked almost to death. And then marched, as the American army came closer, they were marched away, dying along the way as well. So that the Berga case is also another major war crime that the Germans committed against the American soldiers during World War II. So we'll talk about some of these incidences that we've heard from Isabel already. The case of the soldier who was shot for plundering. And then we'll talk about another case as well that ties both Doxsee and Vonnegut together. So I should say right off the bat that the presentation does have some scenes of death and destruction, just to highlight or let you know about that in advance. Everything I'll say tonight is my own opinion based on my research and nothing to do with my previous government employment or military employment. The photographs, mostly many of them are from the National Archives, so they're open source already, but some may be copyrighted or in private collections. Kind of a brief outline, just looking at the two men themselves, where they came from, how they got into the Army, their experiences, prisoners of war together in Dresden, and then kind of setting the stage for Vonnegut's lengthy journey to Slaughterhouse-Five, the novel, and then some little discussion of War and Memory, how the two interacted after World War II. Doxsee was born in New York, so he's not from Ohio. He was a valedictorian of his high school class in 1942. He worked with his father, who owned the Doxsee Sea Clam Company on Long Island. And in fact, this company just went out of business in 2012. So it had been in existence for about 100 years in the family. And then finally, with Hurricane Sandy, went out of business. Doxsee went to study his freshman year at Hobart College in New York, and then entered the Army at that time. He, like most 18-year-olds at the time frame, had to register for the draft, and then the Army called him up about a year later, several months later. And then, as you all know, he was a longtime professor here of history, Ohio University, and active in numerous civic and veterans groups, religious organizations, any number of things, until his death in 2017. And as the obituary here in Athens, the newspaper said, the city of Athens lost a great friend when Gifford Doxsee died. So I'm hoping, and I've already met some people who knew Professor Doxsee when he was alive, and I'm sure there's more in the audience who were neighbors, colleagues, and friends of his. So it'd be interesting to hear more about your thoughts afterwards. Just, we're fortunate, this is from Fold 3, if you're not aware of it. It's a website similar to Ancestry.com, but Fold 3 focuses directly on the military documents, and scans a wide variety of things, not just US information, but Canadian, British. It's pulling together all sorts of resources, making it very available to researchers. So if you go to the National Archives today, you don't have to be a subscriber to Fold 3 or Ancestry.com. It's part of the arrangement that the National Archives has with Ancestry.com, that you can actually look at it for free at the archives, not just the National Archives in Washington, but all the regional archives throughout the country. So this is the draft registration form that Doxsee filled out when he was 18, noting that he was still in college. That was his profession, and gives a little physical description of him just before he actually entered the Army. So Vonnegut, we've heard already a bit about. He's about 2 years, a little over 2 years older than Doxsee. Interestingly, Vonnegut's born on November 11th, Armistice Day, 1922. And Doxsee's born on July 4th, 1924. So I thought that's kind of interesting, both born on national holidays. Coming from a prominent German-American family, his father was an architect. He attended the various schools, was in Cornell University prior to joining the Army, as we've heard, but he really didn't focus on his studies. He was much more into his journalism and his fraternity affairs, and then also his long distance relationship with Jean Cox, his sort of quasi-girlfriend at the time. Of course, he then became much more prominent, and until his death, he was very active, traveling all over the country, giving talks, writing numerous books, and editorials and opinion pieces, quite a cultural icon. This is Vonnegut's draft registration document from, let's see, I think also 1942, I think it says there. And then just like it also provides a physical description, noting that he had a slight scar on the bridge of his nose. So they were that detailed. So both of them end up in the Army, U.S. Army, as privates in 1943. Both ended up in this Army Specialized Training Program, which ASTP, which is kind of a haven for the best and brightest of the American youth, American male youth, ages 18 to 22 in the middle period of the war. This was a program designed to teach them engineering and mathematics and sort of give them an extra chance in college, also to subsidize colleges by having military personnel, because all the military age men had been drafted, but the Army would bring back, and the Navy did the same thing, to have military personnel at these colleges studying, keeping the professors employed, so to speak. So Doxsee studied basic engineering at now what's Auburn University, while Vonnegut moved to two different universities, now Carnegie Mellon and then University of Tennessee. However, the needs of the Army outweighed the needs of these individuals who were sort of hidden out from the war in ASTP. So in February 44, they pretty much closed the program down and essentially made all these men who had been studying and thinking they were going to become officers and sent them directly into combat units in the height of the war in the summer of 44. And then by later that year, they were all, most of them in Europe or in Asia, in the Pacific, fighting. So the official history of the Army Ground Forces noted the ASTP was immediately cut. A large number of its trainees, almost overnight, became infantry privates. For its trainees, the Army Specialized Training Program was a series of disillusionments. So Doxsee then arrives at Camp Atterbury in Indiana. He trains with the 106 Infantry Division as a communication specialist. He was with the 106 Signal Company, but then was later assigned to the combo platoon of the 3rd Battalion, 423rd Infantry Regiment. And these photographs are taken from a yearbook that was published, sort of a yearbook style, published in the summer of 44 by the 106th Infantry Division when they were still at Camp Atterbury before they deployed overseas. So it provides these sort of group photos. I cannot tell when they took this is summer 44, but I can't necessarily say when Doxsee was still training with the 106 or had he been already assigned to the 3rd Battalion, the 423rd Infantry Regiment. So I put both of them in there. Doxsee was actually impressed by his training. He felt it was very rigorous, and he learned a lot as combo specialist, and they functioned as a team well. Of course, this was in training on an Army post in the United States, not actually in combat. But he also recalled, and this was a big problem with most of these infantry divisions in the summer of 44, is that they had continuous waves of replacements. Soldiers were taken out, sent to other divisions who were then sent overseas. Other troops were called in to be trainees. So they had a lot of turnover. So it made it very difficult to build a division level cohesive unit. So really, they had to get to combat to find out what they knew or did not know. Vonnegut also joined the Golden Lions, which was the nickname of the division because of their shoulder and sleeve insignia was a golden lion. Now he said to Professor Klimkovitz that the ASTP was a scheme for stockpiling college kids with no hopes of promotion or getting into OCS, excuse me, Officer Candidate School until they were needed as riflemen. There was already a glut of officers and non-coms. So he studied these various tasks that he knew that the Army wasn't going to use him for. So he found himself also in the 106th Infantry Division, which he complained about bitterly, that he was trained for one thing and assigned to this combat unit for another thing. So you can see this quote here that 30 years after the war, he still felt embittered about it. But if you look at what he actually wrote at the time in the summer of 44 to Jean Cox, his girlfriend, and there is a book that's been published in the last couple of years that came out during just around when COVID, it's about 2020. And it's copies of letters that he wrote to his family, but mostly to Jean Cox. And he said actually he was happy to be with the infantry in a combat unit. So 30 years had a sort of changed his opinion from 1944 to 1975. So he was assigned to the headquarters company, 2nd Battalion, 423rd Infantry Regiment of the 106th Infantry Division. In this case, let's see here. We can see Vonnegut's right here. In his, so he was, I could identify him, but unfortunately not identify Gifford Doxsee. So just quickly kind of going through, they were thrown into the Battle of the Bulge. They took up the front lines. The 3 regiments of the 106th Infantry Division occupied the 3 lines in a supposedly quiet sector along the German-Belgian border. They arrived like the 11th and 12th of December to take over the positions of the veteran 2nd Infantry Division. On the 16th of December, so literally 4 days later, the Germans came crushing through. So by the 19th of December, the 106th Infantry Division was effectively wiped out. Almost all the men were captured, and this marked one of the largest surrenders of the U.S. Army in history and the largest surrender of U.S. forces or U.S. troops in the European theater. So I want to read quickly something, and then we'll watch something that's about 2 minutes. And so you can kind of, from what Vonnegut wrote, you can then actually see, you can see what he was thinking about in his mind, and you can see then actually what actually happened. I've got to find the quote here, but I think it's an interesting one. Okay, this is what Vonnegut wrote in Slaughterhouse 5, so it's fictionalized when they were captured, when his regiment was captured. Both he and Doxsee were in the same regiment. They did not know each other at the time of the battle. Quote, at each road intersection, Billy's group, this is Billy Pilgrim, was joined by more Americans with their hands on top of their hallowed heads. Billy had smiles for them all. They were moving like water, downhill all the time. They flowed at last to a main highway on the valley's floor. Through the valley flowed a Mississippi of humiliated Americans. Tens of thousands of Americans shuffled eastward, their hands clasped on top of their heads. They sighed and groaned. Billy and his group joined the river of humiliation. By the late afternoon sun came out from the clouds. The Americans didn't have a road to themselves. The westbound lane boiled and boomed with vehicles which were rushing German reserves to the front. The reserves were violent, wind-burned, bristly men. They had teeth like piano keys. They were festooned with machine gun belts, smoked cigars, and guzzled booze. They took wolfish bites from sausages and patted their horny palms with potato masher grenades. So that's what he wrote about nearly 25 years later after the battle. So we're going to watch this. This is a World War II German propaganda film from end of 1944, early 1945, when the Germans were still winning, and depicting a scene very much reminiscent of what Vonnegut wrote about and what he and Doxsee underwent. So this is a clip, about 2-minute clip of maybe about a 7-minute long propaganda film. It's available at the National Archives, but you can see the entire clip on the U.S. Holocaust Museum website. The Americans are surrendering en masse. The Germans are gloating about it. They're going to be looking at 2 destroyed German tanks. And then you'll see something of current relevance. These are German troops moving to the front. At the same point, here come the Americans streaming back. And this is just the beginning of their tribulations, because they're captured at the front, but they're having to move all the way back from Belgium to Germany, wounded and soon to be starving because they're not being fed by the Germans. They're marched. The Germans are now gloating because they've also captured American black African Americans prisoners, which are fairly infrequent until this period of World War II, because there were American black soldiers fighting in combat units that were captured right at the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. The SS gloating, very much like what Vonnegut wrote about. Oh, thanks, that's okay. Thank you. And here we get to see more of the German, the Mark IV Panzer moving forward, the Americans moving back. But you see the German army is still very, even though it's mechanized, they're still dependent on a horse and wagon. So there we get the scene of what it looked like and what Vonnegut visualized then as he's writing, and what Billy Pilgrim experienced, what Vonnegut experienced, what Doxsee experienced. So this long march back into Germany, they're then trapped in, and this is also in Slaughterhouse 5, the train ride from the German border to Mühlberg, which is the prisoner of war camp. Right here, 4B is in Mühlberg, right on the Elbe River, just a little bit upstream, or I should say downstream from Dresden, going the Elbe's going north. That's where they ended up, and they were processed as prisoners of war. Altogether, about 8,000 prisoners passed through American prisoners passed through Stalag 4B in this time period of about a month of December into January 45. So it was horrendous. These men were sick. They'd been cramped in these flea-infested wagons. They couldn't go to the bathroom. They couldn't eat. They didn't get water. They were bombed by the British along the way, and a number of them were killed in Limburg en route to going to Mühlberg. Then once they got to Mühlberg, then many of them died of disease or hunger or other respiratory infections, so on. So this is some glimpses of what the Stalag, as we all know, Stalag 13, but this is Stalag 4B, from Hogan's Heroes, which this was definitively not the Hollywood version of what we think about German prisoner of war camps. But in this case, for both Doxsee and Vonnegut, they only were there at Stalag 4B briefly. Most of the prisoners, American prisoners, were actually, because they were enlisted men, they had to work. So they were then grouped into groups of 100, 150 enlisted men. And in Doxsee and Vonnegut's case, they were sent to Dresden as a work camp, a work detail belonging to Stalag 4A, which was closer to Dresden. Even though the Germans were at the end of the war, they're still very meticulous. They made rosters of the soldiers that were transported from Stalag A to Stalag 4B, rather than Stalag 4A. And they noted their prisoner of war numbers, their rank, their name, their parents' name, and other information. So this is these records are at the National Archives. Unfortunately, not the records that cover the 100 or odd men, 150 men that were sent from Stalag 4B with Vonnegut and Doxsee. So I'm still looking for those. They're out there somewhere, but I just haven't found them. But I'd keep looking. But they did retain, this is important, they did retain their Stalag 4B prisoner identification number, because that was where they were first processed, and then they were sent out elsewhere. So in their case, they went to Dresden for this new Arbeitskommando AK, 557, that was a number. It was later redesignated as 1672. They were then quartered in the slaughterhouse district of Dresden, not far from downtown, just right outside in the sort of the factory industrial area of Dresden, including where the rail lines were. So consequently, it was a target for bombing. And there were at least 3 other American POW work details in Dresden in 1945. So you might think, and the way you read it is that, oh, Vonnegut was the only American there, along with the rest in Slaughterhouse 5. No, there were at least a couple hundred other Americans in Dresden who were also bombed. And there is a book by another professor, William Spanos. He was in Dresden, not in the Slaughterhouse 5 work group, but he was there during the bombings. I'm going to pick up the speed, but this is an article that talks about Doxsee, a letter that he was able to write soon after he arrived in Dresden at Slaughterhouse 5. And it says, he is one of the few war prisoners known to be in a forced labor battalion. He was able to write, they were able to write little postcards to their family members back in the United States under the Geneva Conventions. And so this one came through like about, it arrived by April. So Doxsee's mother was able to learn that he was actually alive. So we have the bombing raid, the actual, one of the largest bombing raids of that the US and the RAF did during World War II. In this case, it was actually a firestorm, similar to Hamburg. So massive destruction, physical destruction of the city. The numbers of dead have gone up to 250,000, more than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But more recently, the German, Dresden in Germany, they had a historian commission in 2010, and they've determined that from their examination of a wide variety of records, about 25,000 died. Nonetheless, for the American prisoners of war who were then forced to go in and clean out all the houses, the rubble, and pull out the dead bodies, it didn't matter whether it was 25,000 or 250,000, there was a lot of people. Doxsee talks about it, and Vonnegut certainly talks about it in his various drafts and in the published Slaughterhouse 5. And there are other accounts of this by other veterans from Slaughterhouse 5. They did survive that, the bombing, and the next almost two months of the cleanup in Dresden. As the US forces came closer to Dresden and the Soviets came closer, the Germans evacuated them, all the prisoners and the concentration camp workers, because you have to remember, in Dresden there were a lot of concentration camp workers who were working there in factories, as well as forced laborers. So all these people were merged together and sent down towards the Czechoslovakian border, where they then were being attacked along the way by the Soviets, who were just flying over and strafing these columns. In the end of May, Vonnegut wrote his family talking about what his experiences were. And if you look at this letter, it's very much similar to what we've seen with his articles when he was at the University of Chicago. This letter really outlines what he eventually became Slaughterhouse 5, the book. It talks about what he experienced, what he saw, what happened to him. He mentions that they lost one boy starved to death, and the SS troops shot 2 for stealing food. There's a little asterisk there, it was really 1. And then talks about the attack by the Soviets, which killed more prisoners, but not me. So instead of not me, and so it goes. This is interesting. This is, I think, in the papers here, in the Doxsee papers, but I think also at the Vonnegut papers. One of the veterans of Slaughterhouse 5, Bill Burns, who's right here, he took a number of photographs of their return. When they got to the Czech border, the war was over. The German army vanished, and so they were left on their own. The Soviets came. They were welcome. They had. Oops, sorry, I got to turn this thing off. It has many different lights settings. So then so Vonnegut and about 7 other prisoners of war from Slaughterhouse 5 got a wagon, got some horses, made their way all the way up. It took about 8 days, about a week, to get back to Dresden, where they met up with the Soviets and then waited to be exchanged to the Americans. Doxsee did something similar. He and 2 other soldiers liberated some bikes and rode their way from the Czech border back to Dresden. But in Doxsee's case, they were able to meet the Americans and get out a little bit earlier, about a week ahead of time, or actually 10 days ahead of time, before Vonnegut got out. So Doxsee was able to be liberated by the Americans on the 13th of May, which was Mother's Day and his mother's birthday. So this article came out in 1966, just before, a few years before Slaughterhouse 5. And Vonnegut and the author of this article had Bill Burns there's some correspondence in the Vonnegut papers about this at Indiana University. So, okay, we're end of the war. They're being discharged. They're sent back home. Both Doxsee and Vonnegut were among the last American POWs to leave Europe to go back to the United States. So this is one of the few documents that I found in the National Archives in Washington that has actually Doxsee's name on it. It's orders for his shipment back from Camp Lucky Strike in France back to New York. And these are some photographs from here, from the Doxsee papers that he took. He only weighed about 110 pounds when he was liberated, so he was really ill. He was suffering from diarrhea. He had to be hospitalized for a couple of weeks in France. He did then get leave to go to a furlough, so he was able to go to Paris for the first time, so he remarks about that. And so it took him quite a while to physically recover from his experience as a prisoner of war. And he got home. He was able to get another furlough because he arrived back in New York. He went into New Jersey, but then he got a furlough to go back to see his parents in Long Island. And in the summer of 1945, when he was still on furlough on a lengthy recuperation, 75 days, he started to write his memoirs. But his mother said, "Please don't." It was so painful for her that she couldn't take him writing anything about it. So it wasn't until 1981 that Doxsee wrote his 18-page letter to Ada, a friend of his mother, talking about his war experiences. So it took that long for him to write about it as well. This is the similar story with Vonnegut. He was also in very poor shape coming out from his liberation. Took him a long time, also the first year to recover. The Army was very generous. They authorized not only a lengthy period of leave when they first came back in the summer of 45, but in both cases, they were able to go to resorts for 2 weeks to kind of recuperate, to get ready to go back to the Army. So I believe this is a photograph of Vonnegut and his wife. He married on September 1st, 1945, Jane Cox, and he was sent down to Miami Beach for 2 weeks, and the soldiers could bring their spouses with them for almost a little mini vacation at the military expense, staying in luxury hotels that had been requisitioned by the Army. So in the case of Vonnegut, he went to spend the remainder of his time out Fort Riley, Kansas, kind of just killing time as a clerk until he was discharged in December of 45. And Doxsee was discharged at Fort Bragg in November of 45. So they got out of the Army as soon as they could. This is the orders, also one of the few documents I've seen with Vonnegut's name at the National Archives. These are his orders to ship back from Europe to the United States. Quickly, there is a book that discusses a lot of this. It's here in the library upstairs, and which was done years after the war by the son and the son-in-law of another veteran of Slaughterhouse 5, talking about their interviews and experiences and memories of what these men remembered about Slaughterhouse 5 now, almost 50 years later. And these are the people the men that they determined had died. I've only found that 3 of them were died, the ones with the asterisks. So we'll try to go through those quickly. We've talked about Slaughterhouse 5 and Edgar Derby being caught with a teapot and then shot. Well, the actual atrocity story, the short story that Vonnegut wrote about, is dealing with Michael Paella, who was executed by the Germans with only a summary court-martial, with none of the privileges of the Genevan Convention. He was basically just taken and shot for having a jar of green beans with them. So this was reported to American officials when the soldiers got back to Camp Lucky Strike. When they were being debriefed, they had to fill out questionnaires, and then they were given a sworn statement. They made a sworn statement. This was done by Donini, talking about this case. And then another soldier, Burnside, also answered the questionnaire. And this information then opened up the Army's investigation into the shooting of Private First Class Paella. And these soldiers down here were then interviewed by the Army here back in the United States, and all gave sworn testimony. A friend of Vonnegut's, Private Bernard O'Hare, also provided an additional statement. Neither Doxsee or Vonnegut were interviewed, nor were they mentioned in any of these statements. And I have not found yet that either one of them had completed the standard war crimes questionnaire upon liberation. There were 4 men who buried Paella and another soldier, a Russian soldier, who was executed at the same time. And I say this because these 4 men were all interviewed and all gave statements. In a biography of Vonnegut, it indicates in this biography, current biography, that Vonnegut was one of the members of the burial detail, but from the information that's available, that's not the case. But in this case, the Army closed the investigation, said they did not have enough information on Paella's death. This note was written by Paella just before he was taken by the Germans, given to Private Kingston. Kingston gave it to the Army and asked for it back. The Army did not give the note back to Kingston. The Army did not give the note to Paella's family. So consequently, Paella's family never knew that he had been executed by the Germans. And his brother only learned about this in 1995 from the 2 family members, the other family members. So this is the closing of the case. It lay dormant until the 1990s, when the two family members, Speck and Itzikowski, located this information in the Army files and requested that the German police in Dresden conduct an investigation to find Paella's grave. They were unsuccessful. And then a year later, the Army came and tried the same thing, but they were also unsuccessful. The Army was. So consequently, Paella still remains unrecovered to this day. Edward Crone is the second person who died. This was Joe Crone this is a connection. He was a sophomore at Hobart College when Doxsee was a freshman. So they knew each other, and they both served in ASTP at Auburn University. So they had they knew each other from before the war and then all the way into the war. So he actually died. He's the one who had the 1,000-mile-yard stare that Vonnegut talks about. He died of basically starved to death in April of 45, just before they left Dresden to be liberated. Crone died. He was buried in Dresden. His parents were heartbroken. They couldn't get any information from the Army. They wrote letters to every member of Slaughterhouse 5 work detail to try to get information what happened to their son. They also wrote to the British Red Cross to get information from the British, and they did get these 2 letters back from a doctor, as well as a man of confidence, who confirmed that Crone had died of starvation, was buried in a German cemetery, just as all the prisoners of war were leaving Dresden. His body was located by a British recovery team, who then notified the Americans. And then in January 48, the Americans recovered Crone's body and returned it to, eventually returned, it was identified and returned to the United States, where it was, Crohn's remains were buried in a cemetery in Rochester, New York. His parents, however, still continued to seek information about their son. And this is a little note from in the 1950s in the 106th Infantry Division Veterans newspaper, still seeking information about their son, about the death of Joe Crone. So I've mentioned this because this is important for Vonnegut. He visited the cemetery in 1995 in Rochester when he was up there for a speech, and he found out that Crone was buried there, who then, Joe Crone was a model of Billy Pilgrim for Slaughterhouse 5. And that, for Vonnegut, ended the war. World War II was ended when that burden came off his shoulders. So quickly remembering the war, Doxsee, as I mentioned, didn't write about it because his mother was so overwrought by the loss of her son and the worry that she went through. So he waited till 1981 to write this 18-page letter, which is here in the papers, the Doxsee papers, as well as at IU with the Vonnegut papers, and it's scattered all over the country because Doxsee sent it out to a lot of institutions. Doxsee had only met Vonnegut once or twice after the war. One time, summer '45, he was passing through Indianapolis. He spent an evening with Vonnegut, so that was right after the war when they were still in the Army. And then in 1997, Doxsee and his wife joined Richard Coyle, who was also a veteran of Slaughterhouse 5, and they went to hear a talk that Vonnegut gave up at Ohio Wesleyan, I believe. And they met Vonnegut there briefly after the talk, and so they had a chance to chat together. In '81, Doxsee had sent a copy of his letter, his 18-page memoirs to Vonnegut, and this is Vonnegut's response with a doodle. And this letter is here in the Doxsee papers, as well as the letter that Doxsee wrote Vonnegut. So that's I think, a pretty interesting thing that the Doxsee collection has that also ties in with the Vonnegut papers at IU. This is just my poor digital camera work. It's like the lighting casts a shadow, and I didn't realize it, but you can go see the letter and its originality in the archives. So closing up, history is perishable. We're seeing that today, where we're trying to erase history, and it's happening quickly. But in 1972, the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis caught fire, as you can see here. This massive building was virtually destroyed. It housed all the Army personnel records from World War I all the way up to into the 70s. 80% of the personnel records from World War I to World War II were destroyed. So if you look, I have looked, at the 7 personnel files for the members of Vonnegut's reconnaissance squad, only 1 file is original. All the other files, the six other files had to be reconstructed by the National Archives and the Veterans Administration. So the original files are gone. And there's it's just a massive amount of information that went up in flames. And this kind of gives you a feel of just how devastating it was in the building itself. Doxsee's 2-1 file, gone. I requested his file. What remains of it? It's 3 pages. Vonnegut's is about 17 pages, all post-war stuff. Writing to the VA and requesting things like that. So it's not original material. So that really is unfortunate. It shows that we have to treasure our history. We have to pay for our history to keep it, to preserve it. I think that's one thing that's so important with Ohio University and Indiana University doing Doxsee papers, doing the Vonnegut papers, preserving this material, making it available to everybody, because you can't find this information elsewhere. The original records are really gone. So I'll close there. And so we have hopefully some time for questions, answers, sorry. Thank you very much.
much. We do have time for questions. I'll let the speakers fill those questions if you want that.
Yes.
Thank you. This is wonderful. And just to jump on the bandwagon to say that what archivists do is so important, and we historians appreciate it too. As I was telling Kevin, my husband and I were good friends of Gifford Doxsee's, and one time when I asked him how well he knew Vonnegut, he said, oh, he knew him pretty well because he was the translator between the Americans and the Germans. And so I wanted to have larger context for that. Was he the only fluent German speaker among the American POWs there?
Well, according to Doxsee, there were, in his letter to Ada, there were like four other members of the detail who were considered to be translators. But the commander of the detail picked Vonnegut. That was just when they arrived in Dresden. But as I think as mentioned in Slaughterhouse-Five and also in Doxsee in his memoirs, Vonnegut got in trouble and talked back and said swine, shrine. And so he was struck by one of the guards, and then Junior, who's also talked about, really egged Vonnegut on. So another man took over as translator from Vonnegut, and who was apparently also present at the summary, the drumhead court-martial that Paella had as a translator. But I mean, Vonnegut's German was just high school and a little bit of college, so it wasn't fluent by any means.
I was just thinking that my grandfather was in a similar unit, and he was from a Pennsylvania Dutch family, so he understood enough German, I guess, that he was placed in a similar position with, he just happened to be a little bit more fluent in German than anybody else, and so he was the translator. And I've read Vonnegut's recounting of this. Sometimes I mix them up because they had similar situations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's also interesting, Vonnegut's parents, of course, spoke fluent German, but because of World War I, they stopped.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And, it was just the anti-German sentiment was so great from World War I that neither Vonnegut nor his brother or his sister learned German. And the parents would speak German as sort of to keep it secret from the children.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the effort to recover missing soldiers in Europe. How long did that continue? I mean, are we talking a decade or?
Well, we're talking 80 years because it's still ongoing right now. The U.S. government, the Department of Defense is still searching the world for unrecovered remains from World War II, all the way up to almost present day, particularly World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, a few Cold War casualties. But the bulk of the 80,000 missing unrecovered remains are World War II losses. And so these soldiers like Paella are one of them. And in this case, the Army had only about 3 years from like 1946 to 1949 to do active searching in what was a Soviet occupation zone, then East Germany. But they were tightly controlled by the Soviets, so they just couldn't go from one place to the other and just dig up or look or ask people. The Soviets, they had to have a rigid schedule. They had a checklist a name list of which U.S. soldiers were going into East Germany, and they had an escort from the Soviets. So even if they went to Dresden, they couldn't go to Meissen if it wasn't on the agenda. So if you did not know, if somebody said, oh, he's not buried here, but he's buried 2 kilometers away, the Soviets would not let them go do that. They had to send a whole separate team and a different mission to go there. 1949, it's because of the Cold War, the Soviets stopped the active searching by the Americans in East Germany. Same thing with the British and the French. But then there were occasional searches done by the Army up to 1955. They would do it like once or twice a year, special searches. But until after 1989, or 1990, after reunification of Germany, the Army could not do searches in East Germany. So it's only been in the last 30 years, and really only in the last 20, that the Army, the US government has been searching in East Germany. And they're still finding remains of POWs who died in various camps, airmen who were shot down and crashed and buried, and the graves were lost. They're also doing a number of things of like unidentified remains that are buried in American cemeteries, like the Punch Bowl. They've recovered a number and identified a number of the men who died, like in the USS Oklahoma from Pearl Harbor, because the techniques and the strategy, the scientific tools that were used in the 1940s are still valuable, but DNA offers so much more that they can pinpoint remains that were previously unidentified can now be identified. I will mention, just in addition, something that's easily available online is the Veterans Oral History Project at the Library of Congress. You can just look on the Library of Congress, massive amount of stuff, not just Army, Navy, Air Force, all services, civilians, going mostly back to World War II, but sometimes earlier. And the collection also includes not just the oral history and videotapes, transcripts, but it also includes diaries, letters, other things that they just gave to the Library of Congress. So that's when you're not in Washington, but you're here in Ohio, it's easy enough to log on and look at the Library of Congress website. Another interesting place to look at military records is the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, which was previously the U.S. Army Military History Institute up at Carlisle Barracks. They have a massive amount of stuff. Official records similar to what's at the National Archives, but also lots and lots of oral histories, letters, diaries, memoirs. So a number of things related to Slaughterhouse Five people, including Doxsee's letter to Ada, is also up at Carlisle Barracks.
Please help me thank our wonderful speakers.
Thank you.